I always sensed deep down that my parents had a favorite child between the two of us. What I never could have prepared myself for was the moment they chose to prove it openly, standing at the entrance of a wedding venue with 200 guests watching nearby. I had taken time off work, packed my bags, and driven a full 7 hours just to be there for my sister on one of the most important days of her life. I arrived carrying a gift and wearing a genuine smile, ready to celebrate someone I loved despite everything. But the moment I approached the entrance and saw my parents standing there with cold expressions and crossed arms, something in my chest told me this was not going to be the fresh start I had quietly hoped for. My mother stepped directly into my path before I could even reach the door. My father stood beside her like a wall. They looked at me the way strangers look at someone who has wandered somewhere they do not belong. I laughed nervously and asked what was going on, certain there had been some kind of misunderstanding. Then my mother spoke words that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. She told me this event was for family members only. She pointed toward the entrance and suggested I watch the ceremony through a live stream instead. I stood completely frozen on the spot, waiting for one of them to laugh or tell me they were joking. Neither of them did. Their faces stayed flat and firm. My stomach dropped straight to the ground. I reminded them quietly that I was their daughter, that I was the sister of the bride, that I had just driven 7 full hours to stand in that exact spot. My father shrugged in response, as though my presence was nothing more than a minor inconvenience he wished would go away. My mother's expression never softened for even a single second. Meanwhile, guests walking past had started to slow down and stare. I could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on me, and the humiliation was somehow even sharper than the rejection itself. Every instinct I had wanted to argue, to demand a real explanation, to make them say out loud what they were really doing. But then I realized something that stopped me completely. They were not surprised by my reaction. They were waiting for me to accept it, just like I had always accepted everything else they had handed me throughout my entire life. So I gave them exactly what they expected. I nodded once, said nothing more, turned around, and walked back to my car. No raised voice, no tears, no dramatic exit. Just silence and the sound of my own footsteps walking away from my own family. From the look on their faces in that brief moment before I turned, I could tell my quiet response had unsettled them far more than any argument would have. That evening, I sat alone in my hotel room and watched part of the ceremony through the live stream they had so casually directed me toward. I did not watch it out of any desire to celebrate. I watched it because some part of me still needed confirmation that the whole thing had actually happened, that I had not imagined it, that my own parents had truly looked me in the face and told me I was not welcome at my sister's wedding. By the following morning, one thing had become absolutely clear to me. Something fundamental between me and my family had been broken at that entrance. And it was not the kind of thing that gets repaired with a simple phone call or a brief apology. I spent the next 3 days back home trying to rebuild some kind of normal routine. I forced myself to stop replaying the moment at the door. I stopped trying to understand the reasoning behind it. I stopped waiting for someone to reach out and acknowledge what had been done. I was almost beginning to find my footing again when my phone rang. I nearly let it go to voicemail. Something I still cannot explain made me answer it. The moment the call connected, my sister's voice came through at full volume. She was not crying, not apologizing, and not asking how I was doing. She was shouting at me about a declined card payment and a wedding balance of $23,000 that she had apparently decided was now my problem to solve. I held the phone away from my ear and genuinely wondered for a moment whether she had dialed the wrong number. Then the reality of the situation settled over me, and I actually laughed out loud. Not because anything about it was amusing, but because the sheer audacity of it was almost impossible to process. 3 days earlier, I was not considered family enough to walk through the front door of the venue. Now, apparently, I was considered family enough to be responsible for covering the entire remaining balance of the wedding bill. My father got on the line shortly after and delivered the explanation with complete seriousness. They had simply assumed I would pay it, the same way I had always quietly covered things when money got tight. And he was not entirely wrong about that part. For years, I had been the one who showed up when things went sideways financially. Car repairs, unexpected medical expenses, problems with the house. I never made a production of it. I just helped because they were my family, and I believed that was what family did for each other. Over time, that pattern had apparently shifted in their minds from something they appreciated to something they were simply entitled to receive. They had stopped thinking of my help as a choice I was making freely and started treating it like a resource that would always be available to them, regardless of how they treated me. I told them clearly and calmly that I would not be paying a single dollar toward that bill. The silence on the other end of the line lasted only a few seconds before it dissolved into panic. My mother began pleading in a way I had never heard from her before. My father shifted from demanding to bargaining within the same conversation. And as I listened to both of them scrambling, something inside me shifted permanently. These were not the voices of people who had been thinking about me, missing me, or feeling guilt over what they had done. These were the voices of people who had run out of options and remembered I existed. That distinction mattered more than I had words for in that moment. The calls did not stop after that first conversation. They multiplied. My parents called repeatedly throughout the following days. My sister called. Then various relatives began reaching out one after another, and I quickly understood that a particular version of events had been distributed throughout the family. In this version, I was the one causing a crisis by abandoning everyone during a financial emergency. The part where I had been turned away at the entrance to the wedding had been left entirely out of the story. For a while, I responded to each person individually, explaining what had actually happened. Eventually, I grew exhausted by having to defend myself in 100 separate conversations and decided to simply tell the full truth all at once to anyone who was asking. The response was immediate and significant. Several relatives expressed genuine disbelief, and some of them admitted they had assumed I was exaggerating until guests who had been at the venue that day confirmed every detail of what I had described. The questions that had been pointed in my direction slowly began turning toward my parents instead. My sister offered a string of explanations involving complicated seating arrangements and a difficult guest list. But none of those explanations could account for why distant relatives had been seated comfortably inside while I had been sent back to my car. The more the full picture came into focus for people, the harder it became for anyone to defend what had been done. My father called again about a week after everything had unraveled publicly. His voice was unrecognizable compared to the man who had shrugged at me outside the venue. The anger was completely gone. What replaced it was something closer to exhaustion, and I thought, the first traces of genuine shame. He asked if we could sit down together and talk properly. I agreed, not because I had forgiven anything yet, but because I wanted to close something that had been left painfully open. When I arrived and sat across from both my parents, the atmosphere was entirely different from anything I had experienced with them in recent memory. They looked worn down in a way that went beyond stress about money. My father spoke first and told me plainly that they had been wrong. My mother followed with an apology that surprised me because it reached further back than just the wedding. She acknowledged years of favoritism, years of making me feel like a secondary concern, years of taking my support completely for granted while offering very little in return. Then came the admission I had already suspected, but never heard them say directly. They had genuinely never considered the possibility that I would refuse to help. My financial support had become so consistent and so expected that they had mentally filed it under things that simply happened, like a utility that stays on as long as you do not think about it too much. Hearing them say that out loud was painful in a way that was different from the pain at the wedding entrance. That pain had been sharp and immediate. This was slower and deeper, the kind that comes from finally understanding something you had been half avoiding for years. My father eventually asked whether I might reconsider helping with the remaining balance. I sat with the question for a moment before answering. Then I told him no, and I meant it without any trace of satisfaction or revenge behind the word. I explained that financial support stops being generosity the moment it becomes an assumption, and that belonging to a family should not be something a person only gets credit for when there is a bill that needs paying. Neither of them pushed back. Neither of them argued or tried to find a new angle. They simply sat with what I had said, and that quiet acceptance told me more about how far things had shifted than any words could have. The wedding debt became entirely their responsibility, which was exactly where it had always belonged. In the months that followed, the distance between us gradually began to close, though it closed differently than it ever had before. The change was not driven by me resuming my old financial role. It was driven by the fact that boundaries now existed where there had never been any, and everyone involved finally understood they were real. Looking back on everything, the most significant loss I experienced through all of this was not money, and it was not even the wedding itself. It was the belief I had quietly held for most of my adult life that keeping everyone comfortable and smoothing over every rough edge was somehow my responsibility to carry. Letting go of that belief did not happen because I chose to one day. It happened because I was finally pushed far enough to see what it had actually cost me. And what I gained in its place was something I had not realized I was missing until I finally had it, which was the simple ability to value myself enough to walk away from people who only seemed to remember I existed when they needed something from me. There is a version of this story where I paid the bill, smiled through the tension, and quietly returned to the role everyone had assigned me without ever being asked. I understand why some people would have made that choice, but I also know that version ends with me standing at another entrance someday, being turned away again, and having learned absolutely nothing from the first time. The people who take the most from us are very often the same ones who give us the least reason to keep giving. And sometimes the most honest and necessary thing you can do for a relationship is refuse to keep funding the version of it that was never really working for you in the first place.